I was standing in my own kitchen holding a receipt for the jewelry I thought my husband had bought me for our 30th anniversary when I realized it wasn't for me at all. The woman's name written in his careful handwriting across the top wasn't mine. It was hers. The woman he'd been meeting every Tuesday for the past 2 years. The same Tuesday he told me was his golf day. You know how they say your life can change in an instant? Well, mine changed in the time it took me to read, "For Monica, my dearest love," written in Richard's handwriting on a Tiffany receipt for a diamond tennis bracelet worth more than my car. The same bracelet he'd never given me, despite 30 years of marriage, 3 children, and countless anniversaries where I received practical gifts like vacuum cleaners and kitchen appliances, while he apparently showered diamonds on his secretary. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though the beginning feels like it happened to someone else entirely. Someone naive enough to believe that a good marriage was built on trust and shared sacrifice. Someone who thought that love meant putting your husband's needs before your own, always and without question. That woman, the one I used to be, would have confronted Richard immediately, tears streaming down her face, demanding explanations and promises and apologies. But standing there in my perfectly appointed kitchen, surrounded by the life I'd built through decades of accommodation and compromise, I felt something else entirely settle into my chest. Not hurt exactly, though that was there too. Not even anger, though Lord knows I had reason for that. What I felt was clarity, sharp and cold, and surprisingly liberating. I set the receipt down on the granite countertop that Richard had insisted we couldn't afford when I'd wanted it 15 years ago, the same countertops he'd apparently had no trouble affording for Monica's apartment renovation last spring. Because yes, I'd found those receipts too, tucked away in his desk drawer along with restaurant bills from places he'd never taken me, hotel charges from weekends when he claimed to be at business conferences, and credit card statements showing a pattern of spending that painted a picture of a double life I'd been too trusting to see. The funny thing about trust is how it works in reverse. Once you start seeing the lies, you can't stop seeing them. They're everywhere, woven into the fabric of your daily life like a pattern you'd somehow missed for years. The way Richard always showered immediately when he came home from golf. The way he'd started buying his own clothes instead of letting me help him shop. The way he'd begun carrying his phone with him everywhere, even to the bathroom, and how he'd changed his passcode from our anniversary date to something I couldn't guess. I walked through our house that afternoon like I was seeing it for the first time, really seeing it. The family photos lining the hallway where Richard's smile looked increasingly forced over the years. The master bedroom where we'd gradually migrated to separate sides of the king-size bed, then separate bedrooms entirely when his snoring got worse. The home office where he'd installed a lock last year, claiming he needed privacy for sensitive work documents. I'd accepted it all, every gradual erosion of intimacy and trust, because I'd been raised to believe that marriage required sacrifice and patience and the kind of selfless devotion that apparently made you invisible. But standing there with Monica's receipt in my hand, I wasn't invisible anymore. I was furious, yes, but more than that, I was awake. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was fully, completely awake. Richard came home that evening with flowers from the grocery store, wilted roses that looked like an afterthought, and a story about how busy he'd been at the office. He kissed my cheek with lips that had probably kissed Monica goodbye an hour earlier, and asked what was for dinner with the same casual entitlement he'd shown me for 30 years. I served him pot roast and mashed potatoes and green beans, the same anniversary dinner I'd made for him every year since we were married, and I watched him eat while I planned my next move. Because here's what Richard didn't know about me, what 30 years of taking me for granted had blinded him to. I wasn't just his wife, his cook, his housekeeper, his social coordinator, and his unpaid domestic laborer. I was also a woman with my own education, my own skills, and my own resources that I'd been quietly building while he'd been busy building his relationship with Monica. You see, when the children were young and money was tight, I'd started a small bookkeeping business from home. Just a few clients at first, local small businesses that needed help with their accounts. Richard had barely paid attention to it, dismissing it as Helen's little hobby that brought in pin money. But over the years, that little hobby had grown into a legitimate business with over 40 clients, and that pin money had grown into a 6-figure income that I'd been depositing into my own business account, building my own nest egg for retirement. Richard knew I had some clients, of course, but he'd never bothered to ask for details about my income or my business plans. He assumed, like he assumed everything about me, that he understood the scope of my little domestic life. He assumed I was the same naive 22-year-old who'd married him fresh out of college, grateful for his attention and eager to build a life around his needs and ambitions. He assumed I needed him for financial security, for social standing, for the basic framework of adult life. He was wrong about all of it. That night, after Richard fell asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and began researching divorce attorneys. Not just any attorneys, but the best ones in the state, the ones who specialized in high-asset divorces and had reputations for protecting their clients' interests. I made a list of names, phone numbers, and initial consultation fees. I researched the process for asset discovery, for subpoenaing financial records, for tracing hidden accounts and undisclosed spending. I learned about alimony calculations and property division and the legal implications of adultery in our state. By 3 a.m, I had a comprehensive plan. The next morning, I called Richard's office and asked to speak with Monica, claiming I wanted to plan a surprise party for Richard's upcoming birthday. Her voice was younger than I'd expected, breathier, with that affected sweetness that some women use when they're trying to sound innocent. She was eager to help, practically gushing about how wonderful Richard was and how lucky I was to be married to such a successful, generous man. She suggested I might want to include some of his golf buddies from the country club, the ones he spent so much time with on Tuesdays. "Oh," I said, as if just remembering, "but he plays golf on Tuesdays. Won't they be busy?" "Golf?" Monica laughed, a tinkling sound that made my teeth ache. "Richard doesn't play golf on Tuesdays. He's usually here with me, working on special projects." Special projects. I thanked her for her time and hung up, adding bold-faced liar willing to deceive spouse to my growing list of Monica's qualities. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that people don't bother to hide things from you. They assume you're too simple, too trusting, too dependent to be a threat. Over the next 3 weeks, I gathered information with the methodical thoroughness of an accountant, which of course I was. I photographed documents, recorded phone conversations, tracked spending patterns, and built a comprehensive picture of Richard's secret life. I discovered that Monica wasn't just his secretary and mistress. She was also his business partner in a consulting firm he'd started using our joint assets, the same assets he'd claimed we needed to be careful with when I'd wanted to renovate our kitchen or take a vacation somewhere more exotic than the same beach house we'd rented for 20 years. I found evidence of joint credit cards, a shared apartment lease, and even a joint investment account where Richard had been depositing money that should have been going into our retirement savings. But the piece of evidence that sealed Richard's fate wasn't financial. It was personal. I was going through his laptop one afternoon while he was at the office, downloading files and printing emails, when I found a folder labeled Future Plans. Inside were house listings in Florida, wedding venues, and a draft of an email to a divorce attorney. Richard wasn't just cheating on me. He was planning to leave me, but he wanted to do it in a way that would maximize his financial advantage and minimize his legal obligations. The email to the attorney was particularly enlightening. Richard had written that he wanted to minimize spousal support obligations and protect assets from division by demonstrating that his wife had been financially irresponsible and contributed minimally to the household income. He wanted to characterize my business as a hobby and my contributions to our marriage as domestic services that could be easily replaced. Easily replaced. 30 years of marriage, of building a life together, of supporting his career while managing our household and raising our children, and I could be easily replaced. That's when I stopped being sad and started being strategic. I made an appointment with Margaret Chanman, the most expensive divorce attorney in the city, the one with a reputation for destroying unfaithful husbands in court. I brought her my carefully organized files, my documentation of Richard's affair and financial deception, and my own business records showing that I'd been contributing significantly more to our household income than Richard had realized. Margaret was a small woman in her 50s with silver hair and the sharpest suit I'd ever seen. She listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally making notes in handwriting, so neat it looked like calligraphy. When I finished, she leaned back in her leather chair and smiled, the kind of smile that probably made opposing attorneys very nervous. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "your husband has made several crucial errors. First, he's underestimated you. Second, he's documented his own misconduct. And third, he's hidden assets in a way that actually makes them more vulnerable to division, not less. With your business income and the evidence you've gathered, we can not only secure you a very favorable settlement, but we can also make sure he pays your legal fees." She quoted me a retainer that would have made me panic 6 months earlier. Instead, I wrote her a check from my business account and asked when we could begin. "We can begin," Margaret said, "as soon as you're ready to stop being married to him." I thought about that question for exactly 3 seconds. I've been ready for 20 years. I just didn't know it. Margaret's plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would file for divorce immediately, but we wouldn't tell Richard until after we'd had a chance to secure my interests. She obtained a court order to freeze our joint accounts and prevent Richard from moving or hiding assets. She subpoenaed his business records, his personal accounts, and his credit card statements. She hired a private investigator to document his relationship with Monica and to identify any other financial irregularities. Most importantly, she helped me realize that I had far more power in this situation than Richard had led me to believe. "You've been supporting the household financially for years," she explained. "Your business income exceeds his salary, you own your business outright, and you've been the primary caretaker for the home and children. In this state, that makes you entitled to significant spousal support, a large portion of the marital property, and potentially damages for his adultery." I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Powerful. The day Margaret served Richard with divorce papers, I was sitting in her office watching through the window as her process server approached the restaurant where Richard was having lunch with Monica. They were at an outdoor table holding hands across white linen, sharing what looked like a very intimate conversation. Monica was wearing the tennis bracelet, the one Richard had bought her with our money, the one that caught the sunlight like a beacon of betrayal. I watched Richard's face change as he read the papers. I watched him fumble for his phone, probably to call me, probably to try to explain or apologize or negotiate. I watched Monica lean forward, confused and concerned, as Richard's face went pale and then red and then pale again. My phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again, and again, and again. "He's going to be very upset," Margaret warned me. "Men in his position often become desperate when they realize they've lost control of the situation. He'll probably try to convince you to withdraw the filing, promise to end the affair, offer counseling. He might even threaten you." She was right about all of it. Richard came home in a rage that night, shouting about betrayal and loyalty and how I was destroying our family over a misunderstanding. He called me vindictive, irrational, hysterical. He accused me of spying on him, of being suspicious and paranoid and impossible to live with. He told me that if I'd been a better wife, a more interesting companion, a more attentive partner, he never would have needed to look elsewhere for affection. I listened to him rant while I packed the last of my things into suitcases I'd bought that afternoon. I'd already moved the most important items to the furnished apartment I'd rented downtown, close to my office, with a view of the river and space for the new life I was building. "Helen," he said finally, his voice switching to the wheedling tone he used when he wanted something, "we can work this out. I'll end it with Monica. We can go to counseling. We can take a trip, work on our marriage. Don't throw away 30 years over one mistake." I stopped packing and looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. He was still handsome in the way that successful men in their 50s often are, with silver hair and expensive clothes, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to question your place in the world. But I could see the fear behind his eyes now, the panic of a man who'd built his life on controlling others and was suddenly discovering that control was an illusion. "One mistake, Babdoama," I said. "Richard, I found receipts going back 2 years. I found emails, credit card statements, hotel bills, apartment leases. This isn't one mistake. This is a double life. This is a systematic deception that involves stealing from our marriage to fund your relationship with another woman." "I never stole anything, Yavemang," he said. "That money was mine to spend." "Our money," I corrected. "From our marriage. Money that should have been going to our retirement, our home, our shared future. Money you spent on another woman while telling me we couldn't afford things I wanted." "You don't understand business," he said, falling back on the condescending tone he'd used to dismiss my opinions for years. "That money was an investment. Monica and I were building something together, a consulting firm that would benefit both our families." "Both your families?" I laughed, a sound that surprised me with its bitterness. "Richard, you were planning to divorce me. I found the email to your attorney. You were going to leave me for Monica and try to minimize what you owed me in the settlement. You called my business a hobby. You said I could be easily replaced." His face went white. "You had no right to look at my private correspondence." "I had every right. I'm your wife. Or I was until about 6 hours ago when you were served with papers." I zipped up my last suitcase and set it by the door with the others. "The locks will be changed tomorrow. Margaret has filed for exclusive use of the house during the divorce proceedings, and the court has granted it based on your adultery and financial misconduct. You'll need to find somewhere else to live. You can't kick me out of my own house? I'm not kicking you out of your house, Richard. I'm kicking you out of our house. The house we bought together. The house I've been maintaining and improving for 30 years. The house where I raised our children while you were busy building your secret life. He stared at me like he'd never seen me before. What's happened to you, Helen? This isn't like you. You're right, I said. This isn't like the old me. The old me would have begged you to stay, would have blamed herself for your affair, would have tried to win you back by being more accommodating, more understanding, more invisible. But the old me didn't know what I know now. What's that? That I don't need you. That I never needed you. That for the past 15 years, I've been financially supporting this household while you've been playing house with your secretary. That I built a successful business while you were telling everyone it was a cute hobby. That I have resources and skills and strength you never bothered to notice because you were too busy taking me for granted. I picked up my suitcases and walked toward the door. Oh, and Richard? Monica might want to reconsider her business partnership with you. Your assets are frozen pending the divorce settlement, which means the consulting firm you started with our money is probably going to be liquidated. I hope she saved some of that jewelry money. I left him standing in our living room, surrounded by the life we'd built together, the life he'd destroyed with his greed and selfishness and arrogance. I felt lighter with every step I took toward my car, like I was shedding 30 years of accumulated disappointment and compromise. The divorce proceedings took 8 months, 8 months during which Richard tried every strategy his attorney could devise to minimize the settlement. He claimed that my business was a recent development, that I'd hidden my income from him, that I was vindictive and unreasonable and trying to punish him for a brief lapse in judgment. He painted himself as the victim of a bitter, jealous wife who couldn't forgive one mistake. Margaret destroyed him in depositions. She presented evidence of his systematic deception, his financial misconduct, his use of marital assets to fund his affair. She brought in testimony from my clients about the scope and duration of my business success. She documented his attempts to hide assets and minimize my contributions to the marriage. Most devastatingly, she presented his own emails and documents showing that he'd planned to leave me all along, that the affair with Monica wasn't a mistake, but a calculated decision to replace me with someone younger and more accommodating. The final settlement exceeded even Margaret's initial projections. I received the house, half of all marital assets, significant spousal support, and damages for adultery. Richard's consulting firm was dissolved, with his share of the assets going toward the settlement. His retirement accounts were split, his investment portfolio was divided, and his future earning potential was garnished for spousal support. But the most satisfying part wasn't financial. It was watching Richard realize that he'd lost everything by trying to have everything. Monica left him 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Apparently, Richard, without money and social standing, wasn't as attractive as Richard with a secret expense account and a naive wife at home. She found someone else, someone who could afford the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to during their affair. Richard, meanwhile, moved into a one-bedroom apartment and took a job with another firm at a fraction of his previous salary. I ran into him at the grocery store last spring, almost 2 years after our divorce was finalized. He looked older, diminished somehow, like the confidence and certainty that had defined him for so long had simply evaporated. He was buying frozen dinners and generic cereal, the kind of shopping that spoke of a man living alone without much money or hope. Helen Wasway, he said, stopping his cart next to mine. You look well. I did look well. I'd lost 20 pounds, cut my hair, updated my wardrobe, and started taking yoga classes. I'd also expanded my business, taken a 3-week trip to Italy, and begun dating a lovely man named David who owned a bookstore and appreciated both my intelligence and my independence. Thank you, I said. I am well. I've been thinking, Richard said, about what happened between us, about the mistakes I made. I wonder if we might be able to have coffee sometime to talk about whether there might be a chance for us to try again. I looked at him, this man who had shared my bed for 30 years, who had fathered my children, who had been the center of my world for most of my adult life. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no nostalgia, no regret. Nothing at all. Richard, I said gently, I hope you find happiness. I really do. But I've found mine, and it doesn't include you. I left him standing there in the cereal aisle and finished my shopping, picking up ingredients for the dinner party I was hosting that weekend for my new friends, successful women in their 50s and 60s, who had built lives of purpose and joy after their own various disappointments and betrayals. That evening, I sat on the deck of my house, My house now, officially and completely, watching the sunset over the garden I was redesigning according to my own tastes for the first time in decades. I had a glass of wine, the expensive kind I'd always wanted to try, but Richard had deemed unnecessary, and I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, standing in her kitchen with a receipt for jewelry meant for another woman. That woman had thought her life was ending. She thought betrayal meant failure, that divorce meant defeat, that starting over at 58 was impossible. She'd been wrong about all of it. My life hadn't ended when I discovered Richard's affair. It had begun. For the first time in 30 years, I was living entirely for myself, making decisions based on my own needs and desires, building a future that reflected my own values and dreams. I had money in the bank, a business I loved, friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I could do for them, and the deep, satisfying knowledge that I had never been as helpless or dependent as I'd believed. The next morning, I did something I'd been planning for months but hadn't quite had the courage to execute. I wrote a check for $50,000, more money than Richard had ever spent on me in a single year, and I gave it to Monica's biggest rival in the real estate business, where she'd landed after Richard's consulting firm collapsed. Not because I wanted revenge exactly, but because I wanted to make a point. Richard had spent our money on another woman, believing that I was too weak and too grateful to fight back. Now I was spending my money, the money I'd earned through my business, the money that was legally and completely mine, to support the success of someone who competed directly with the woman he'd chosen over me. It felt like poetry. It felt like justice. It felt like the perfect ending to a story that had started with betrayal and ended with triumph. Monica, I heard through various social connections, did not take the professional competition well. Her real estate business struggled against her newly well-funded rival, and she eventually moved to another city, another fresh start, another chance to find someone else's husband to help her climb the social ladder. As for Richard, he sent me a letter last Christmas, a long, rambling apology that tried to recast our marriage as a partnership that had simply grown apart, his affair as a regrettable but understandable response to the distance between us. He asked for my forgiveness not because he wanted me back, but because he needed to believe that he wasn't the villain in our story. I never replied to the letter. Not because I was angry, but because I'd moved so far beyond our shared past that his need for absolution simply wasn't relevant to my life anymore. I'd built something new and beautiful from the ashes of our marriage, and I wasn't interested in looking backward. These days, I wake up in my own house, in my own bed, and I make decisions about my day based entirely on what will bring me joy and satisfaction. I work with clients I respect. I travel to places I've always wanted to see. I spend time with people who value my thoughts and opinions and company. I've learned to play tennis, taken up watercolor painting, joined a book club, and started volunteering at a women's shelter where I help other women learn financial independence. Sometimes lying in bed at night, I think about the 30 years I spent believing that my worth was tied to Richard's approval, that my security depended on his success, that my happiness was secondary to his needs. I think about all the dreams I deferred, all the compromises I made, all the times I made myself smaller so he could feel bigger. I don't regret those years exactly, because they led me to this life, this hard-won wisdom, this deep appreciation for my own strength and capability. But I do mourn them a little, the way you might mourn any long illusion that kept you from seeing your own power. The woman I am now wouldn't recognize the woman I was then, the one who stood in her kitchen holding evidence of her husband's betrayal and thought her world was ending. That woman believed she needed permission to be angry, needed someone else's approval to be valuable, needed a man's love to be worthy of respect. This woman knows better. This woman knows that love without respect is just another form of servitude, that loyalty without reciprocity is just another name for exploitation, that forgiveness without accountability is just enabling bad behavior. This woman knows that the best revenge isn't spite or bitterness or the kind of petty cruelty that diminishes everyone involved. The best revenge is building a life so fulfilling, so joyful, so completely your own that your betrayer's opinion of you becomes irrelevant. Richard thought he could replace me easily, that 30 years of marriage had taught him everything about my limitations and nothing about my strengths. He thought I would beg him to stay, would accept his crumbs of affection, would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he chose to give me after he'd fed the best parts of himself to another woman. He thought wrong about all of it. The truth he learned too late is that I was never the consolation prize in our marriage. I was the prize, the one worth winning, the one whose love and loyalty and partnership had value beyond anything he'd found with Monica or anyone else. I was the one who built our home, raised our children, managed our social life, supported his career, and created the foundation that allowed him to feel secure enough to risk it all on a shallow affair with a woman half his age. I was the one who could be counted on, who could be trusted, who brought intelligence and creativity and genuine care to everything I touched. I was the one whose business acumen had been quietly supporting our lifestyle for years while he spent our joint assets on his secret relationship. I was never easily replaceable. I was irreplaceable. And now, thankfully, I am also unavailable. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about marriage or betrayal or divorce exactly. It's about knowing your own worth, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes it. It's about building your own security, your own identity, your own sources of satisfaction that don't depend on someone else's choices or priorities or faithfulness. It's about understanding that you are not responsible for someone else's character, but you are entirely responsible for your own response to their choices. You can choose to be a victim of someone else's selfishness, or you can choose to be the author of your own liberation. I chose liberation. I chose dignity. I chose a life built on my own terms, funded by my own work, shared with people who see my value clearly and celebrate it openly. And if that choice happened to cost Richard everything he thought he wanted, well, that's simply the natural consequence of his own decisions. I didn't destroy his life out of spite. I saved my own life out of self-respect. The difference matters. The difference is everything. These days, when I meet women who are struggling with similar betrayals, similar choices, similar moments of devastating clarity about the people they've trusted most, I tell them what I wish someone had told me years earlier. You are more powerful than you know. You have more options than you can see. You deserve more respect than you're receiving. And sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering that the person you thought you couldn't live without is actually the person you're much better off living without. Richard did me a favor when he chose Monica over me. He freed me from the exhausting work of loving someone who didn't value what I offered, of building a life with someone who was secretly building a different life entirely. He gave me the gift of clarity, the motivation for change, and the opportunity to discover who I could be when I stopped trying to be who he needed me to be. For that, if nothing else, I suppose I should thank him. But I won't, because the woman I am now doesn't need his approval for anything, not even gratitude. I have everything I need, and everything I have I earned myself.